So I have a reading for you today from John chapter 8, starting in verse 2. Speaking of Jesus, at dawn he appeared again in the temple courts, where all the people gathered around him, and he sat down to teach them. The teachers of the law and the Pharisees brought in a woman caught in adultery. They made her stand before the group and said to Jesus, "Teacher, this woman was caught in the act of adultery. In the law, Moses commands us to stone such a woman. Now, what do you say?" They were using this question as a trap in order to have a basis for accusing Jesus. But Jesus bent down, started to write on the ground with his finger. And when they kept on questioning him, he straightened up and he said to them, "Let any one of you who is without sin be the first to throw a stone at her." And again he stooped down and wrote on the ground. And at this, those who heard began to go away, one at a time, the older first, until Jesus was only left with the woman who was still standing there. And Jesus straightened up and he asked her, "Woman, where are they? Has no one condemned you?" "No one, sir," she says. "Then neither do I condemn you," Jesus declared. "Go now and leave your life of sin." It is one of, if not the most loved stories in the gospel. And ironically, it's likely one that John never wrote down, added later. But even given that asterisk mark beside the story, it is beloved by Christians of all stripes in churches all over the world. I probably didn't need to read the story to you. You knew it so well. It was just, I started out and you go, "Oh yes, I love this. I love this story." One morning early, Jesus shows up at the temple. And the crowds come down. The crowds come down and gather around him. And they are waiting for him to teach. And he's about ready to start teaching them. When those who were experts in the law, these people are Pharisees. Don't boo them yet, okay? They're students of the law. They spend their lives poring over the law. And this other group, sometimes referred to as scribes, better known probably as the professors of the spiritual educational institutions, okay? Those who wrote the books and know the stuff and studied the rabbis, they're there. And it says that they come bringing this woman caught in adultery. And I find that phrase interesting. Caught in adultery. It's early in the morning, so the assumption I would have is that they pulled her out of the bed of her lover and brought her here. But it begs the question, how did they catch her? I mean, did they follow her partner to her house and then just waiting, peering through the window at just the right time, break in and snatch her out? And of course the other question is, where's the partner? I mean, it's true that these things are sin, but if you're going to be catching, you can't catch one person committing adultery, okay? But suddenly, what she was doing in darkness has been brought out into the brightness of daylight, and a very, very public daylight. They had her stand in front of everyone. At church. There is probably no greater public humiliation than this moment. And they turn to Jesus and they say, "Moses says this woman committed adultery, should be stoned. What do you say? And I find that interesting as well, because these guys posing the question, they're the experts. They're the ones who study the law. They're the ones who wrote the textbooks. They know what Scripture says. You would think they would be asking one another, or asking the Sanhedrin, or asking somebody, but they turn to this rural rabbi who's teaching in the back corner of the temple, and they ask him, what do you think needs to be done here? So why was he brought into this equation? Why was he part of this event? And then we get our answer. John has this parenthetical statement here. Probably he witnessed the event, so he can assess motives that are going on. The statement says this: they were asking this in an attempt to trap him, so that they could bring charges against him. And now all of a sudden the whole thing makes sense. This whole business is just theater. This isn't being played out in a righteous request to punish sin, or to redeem this woman, or to protect the morality standards of the nation. This is a trap. It's not a spiritual matter. It's a political matter for these people. And it's enacted by the most powerful people in Israel's spiritual world against this powerless woman. And while Jesus bent down and wrote in the dirt, they kept pestering him. What do you think should be done with her? You know what the law says. What do you think? You going to call for execution? Tell me what you think we ought to do here. And now I start getting a clearer picture of what's going on here. See, the law did command that people who committed adultery, that they be stoned. So it's not like they're making this up. It's not like some rabbi 100 years back all of a sudden said this should be the punishment. That this is in the law. But the law assumes it takes two to tango. So there's clearly a disconnect here about what's going on. And by the time Jesus came along, executions, and particularly stonings, were so rare. It says, Jewish Mishnah said you had to go back hundreds of years before you could identify another judicial stoning approved of by the Jewish courts. And really, by the time of Jesus, Jews didn't have the power to do any executions. They had to turn it over to Rome for a Roman judiciary to decide execution had to take place. And it wouldn't be by stoning then. It'd be by crucifixion or some other form of punishment. So they did not have the power. This was not a common practice. And that might be the final answer. Because the Pharisees weren't just interested in testing Jesus' public image, putting him in the squeeze here about, are you going to be for the people? But now all of a sudden, this is a matter that brings Rome into it. Are you going to stand with Rome, or are you going to stand with God? Sounds kind of like our political world we live in today, right? That one is opposed to the other, and we're throwing these barbs out at people. It doesn't matter, really, because in the light of all that, I think we would all agree that this event is a great injustice. This powerless woman is being treated like a pawn for the political chess game that's being played out here. And she's a pawn that those who are playing on the other side have no qualms about sacrificing for the sake of winning this match. Or better yet, getting Jesus to appear on Rome's radar or arrested by him. So there's nothing just in this story, and it just makes us angry when we see that kind of injustice take place. And part of that is because at our core, we have a passion to see justice done. It's difficult to define justice, and sometimes it's in the eye of the beholder. I get that, but there are two key components to justice. And one is this: justice must be just. Now, I'm going to be nailed by English teachers here who said you can't use the word to define the word, but I mean by that it must be right. When we say, I need justice, or that is unjust, what we're saying is that's not right. There's something evil about it, something wrong about that. It's got to be based on some higher, unassailable sense of righteousness. It's not just my opinion. It's not that I think it's unjust and you think it's just. It's that, no, somewhere we need to appeal to some source, some power, some authority that says these things are just and good and these things are unjust and evil. And it's interesting for those in our world who are agnostics or atheists crying out for justice, when that cry in and of itself is a plea for a higher sense of authority than they're willing to acknowledge exists. But justice must be right. It must be based on the right thing to do. And the second thing is this: justice must be fair. Part of being right is that you offer the same punishments or benefits to rich and poor alike, to the well-connected, to the nameless, to the popular, to the overlooked. So when we see leaders, presidents of major banking get bonuses when their policies brought about the housing crisis, while thousands of homeowners went into bankruptcy and lost their homes and their mortgages, you got to say there's something not fair about this. There's something unjust about this connection. And it's sad to admit that sometimes throughout history the church has not been the beacon of justice that we would like it to be. Racial segregation. You know, I grew up in the South going to church and was oblivious because I was a kid, without the faculties to think through the whole thing. But it pains me today to know that the churches should have been the clarion voice in those societies, calling out for fair treatment for people of all races, and we weren't. And I extend mercy to people who are good-hearted, who just didn't have their wits together, but we're called to be better than that. And when churches cover up the sexual sins or the power sins of their leaders because their leaders make the church, and without that leader, the church is not going to exist, or it may crumble, and so we got to cover things up, and it's like, it's not just when that happens. And so it's no wonder when people look at the church sometimes, outside the church usually, but sometimes inside the church, people who've been wounded here, they look at the church and they go, you're not a beacon of justice. You're a partner to injustice. In 1994, in Rwanda, there was civil war between the Hutus and the Tutsis, two tribal groups in the country. And it had reached a boiling point when over 100 days in the spring and summer of 1994, there was a planned, orchestrated genocide that was carried out by the Hutus against the Tutsis. Macheted to death, many of them were. Resulting, it's hard to get numbers, nearly 1 million people died in this relatively small country. And as tragic as that story is, the real tragedy is this: that much of it was aided and abetted by churches inside Rwanda. Tutsi people escaping villages where they were being attacked ran to churches for solace and protection. And they were welcomed in the churches. And once they were in, the leaders of the churches would close the doors and lock the doors and wait for the Hutus to come and to carry out genocide among the people who had gathered there. And a decade later, a friend and missionary of mine, Marty Kuntz, was tasked to go to Rwanda as a missionary. And he had the unenviable task of taking the gospel to Rwanda and trying to demonstrate to people who had lived through that horror that the God of Scripture hated the injustice that was carried about by people who were wearing his name. That was a tough assignment. So you can imagine how for some people this story about the woman caught in adultery, this pierces their heart. There are people like that woman, powerless people who've been labeled or dismissed or taken, people whose lives are full of sin and long for something better. And so this story of the woman caught in adultery, this is their story. And they are waiting with bated breath, watching Jesus right in the dirt, wondering, what's he going to say? Whoever among you is guilty may be the first to throw a stone at her. Whoa. Now, I know we love that answer, but let's pause for a few moments as we deal with that. In this moment, where Jesus' public image is at risk, where his political future hangs in the balance, he doesn't spin an answer. He doesn't hem and haw about this. He says there is something very unjust going on, and I'm going to put a stop to it right now. So, if you know somebody who thinks the church or Christians in general or maybe God himself is just unjust, I think it's important to remind them Jesus hates injustice. And he's willing to risk everything to protect those who are being treated unjustly. And that conviction is echoed throughout the rest of the gospel stories. Jesus says we should not judge lest we be judged by other people, and that the Sabbath was made for people, not people in order to serve the Sabbath. And although he rarely gets angry, the times he does get angry, it's usually aimed at somebody with power who is exercising unjust control over somebody else who lacks power and influence. And Jesus just riles at that. He's not dismissing wrong behavior. He's not ignoring the commands of the law, but he is saying that this: all people are made in God's image, and we should treat all of them as his image bearers. And that's what it means to be just. That's why in another famous statement, Jesus says this: for God did not send his Son into the world to condemn the world, but to save the world through him. You probably heard that passage before. You might even thought about what it means, but I want us to pause for a moment and let's just give it a few moments here. Jesus is not saying that judgment will not come to those who reject and dishonor God. What he is saying is that that is not his mission. His mission is to come and to save, not to come and condemn. So how do we carry out that mission in our world? Well, we do it by things like helping at Room at the Inn. Where's Steve? You know, when you deal with people who are clients at Room at the Inn or any agent like that, you admit up front, sometimes they are here because of their own devices, their own bad choices, their own personal failures. But don't be mistaken. They have also been mistreated by family or deceivers or the system, just like this powerless woman caught in adultery. And so we see the image of God in them, and we want better for them, and we are there because this is just to protect. We do it when we help illegal immigrants. Even though their presence here may not be according to the law, they're still God's image bearers, and so they deserve a compassionate justice that cares for them. We do it when we seek racial reconciliation and unity. Had an event last night over at McKnight that focused on that. Even if it's true that you've never acted with prejudice about anyone in the world, and I doubt that's true, but let's assume that for a moment. Even if that's true, our love for God and those made in his image compels us to strive to know the hurts and the fears of people who walk in shoes other than ours and to seek justice for them. And we do it when we offer forgiveness for those who've wronged us. Because no one is beyond our compassion or God's redemption. Even our own moral failings require someone to come to us and act with merciful justice sometimes, you know. That's why he says, you who are without sin, cast the first stone. It's kind of that open awareness. Yes, this is wrong, but take a look at yourself first before you start casting stones. And when he says that, every one of her accusers disappeared. You wonder why they did? Yeah, they probably tallied up their list, right? Because we know that if I'm going to treat somebody with cruel injustice, then I'm also saying it's all right for someone to treat me that same way. And with no one to level charges at her, Jesus says, I don't condemn you. Now, if you were raised in a home like mine, we had a clear sense of rigid boundaries, okay? And this verse, as Zach would say, this verse gives me pause, all right? Jesus is telling an adulterer that the just thing to do here is not to condemn her. And I want to preface all over that. And just when you're thinking, boy, I like this justice thing of Jesus. That's pretty. He wants to call out the wrong of the powerful and the elite. He stands for the common man. He thinks I'm wonderful. Woohoo! All for justice. Jesus turns to the woman and he says, go, and from now on, don't sin any longer. Now, wait a minute. I thought the religious leaders were the bad guys here. I thought the ones that dragged her out of the house, that made a public spectacle of her, that they were the unjust ones. And you know, we tend to do it a lot. We've got two hats. We got a black cowboy hat, and we've got a white cowboy hat. And we assign those hats out. So when a marriage crumbles that we know of, we're looking, aren't we? Who gets the black hat? Ah, you get the black hat because you've done X, Y, and Z. And by turnabout, what does that mean the other person gets? The white hat. Because they're innocent. Sometimes we use that phrase, the innocent party. When the powerless is abused by the powerful, we boo and we hiss at the powerful and we give the powerless a pass. Yeah, do whatever you like. This is... When someone who looks like us and thinks like us and lives like us deserves justice, we say, we understand. But when somebody who doesn't look like us and doesn't think like us and doesn't live in our circles does it and they deserve justice, we throw the book at them. We only have two hats. Somebody's got to be the good guy. Somebody's got to be the bad guy. Someone's got to wear the black hat. Someone's got to wear the white hat. Jesus says, everybody gets a black hat. Everybody gets a black hat. We're all villains. We all deserve punishment. And while at times a fight for justice means calling out one over another, we need to remember there's no one righteous. No, not one. So although he came to defend this woman because she was being mistreated, she's by no means innocent. She needs someone to protect her from those who are unjustly trying to overpower her and use her. But she also needs someone to come alongside and to save her from her own failings. Pursuing justice means that we do both of those things. We protect people from injustice, and we call people to find new life in Jesus. We defend the mistreated, but we don't excuse their sinfulness. We protect the abused, but we don't give approval to acts of retaliation. We stand up for failed and the fallen, but we show them that God's future for them is a different lifestyle and a different path to walk. And I got to admit, that is messy. And we rarely get it right. But I'm reminded, God is the only one who is just. And I stand in line like everybody else. I don't live up to the calling he has for me. I deserve punishment and wrath just like everyone else. I rest my hope on his mercy and his ability to make unjust Scott justified. 10 verses in the middle of John. 10 verses he may not have written in the first place. But 10 verses that forever remind me that Jesus hates injustice. He offers justice to flawed people who were abused and mistreated by those in power. And he sought to bring hope and salvation to everyone. Now, that's a Jesus worth sharing with people. Let's stand and sing this song together.